Hello, everybody. So for the Chapter 2 overview video, we're going to be going over neuroscience. So what exactly is neuroscience? Well, I'm going to press the wrong buttons. Neuroscience, get the right color, is the study of how the brain and nervous system affect our mental processes and behavior. So, as you recall from all the way back in Chapter 1 last week, we discussed how psychology is all about looking at behavior and mental processes. So, neuroscience then is very important. And it very much relates to a lot of overarching perspectives of psychology, specifically with cognition. And when we talk about memory, you'll see how our specific functions of the brain play a role in memory. So let's look at our learning objectives for today. So just a quick overview, we're going to talk about the basic structure of a neuron, specifically with action potentials. We're going to discuss neurotransmitters and neuromodulators and their functions. We're going to talk about the major parts of the nervous system. And then we're going to discuss the parts of the brain, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And discuss a little bit on the aging brain. And then, excuse me, finally, brain imaging techniques. So let's get started. So with section 1, we're going to focus in on neurons. So a neuron is just cells within our nervous system that transmit information. It is, at its core, the most basic form of communication within our brain. So let's say you touch something very hot. The neurons in your fingertips send information up to your spinal column. So it helps you sense the world around you and initiate movement without you even having control in a way. It's an automatic process. So in response to the threat, you touching that something hot, signals are then sent back down from the spine to the muscles of your arm. So the result is you jerking your arm jerking your arm away from the really hot item, as you can see right here. And that is called a reflex. So neurons are a very important part of the nervous system, but so too are glia cells. So what glia cells do is they support and nourish the neurons. They aid in neural signaling, and they help the system build and it create new neural networks. And then we have our myelin. So our myelin is a protective sheath that surrounds parts of the neuron that is actually made from glia cells. So myelin is really important, and you'll find that if it starts to break down, which happens in cases of MS or multiple sclerosis. So in MS, it attacks and destroys the myelin insulation on neurons. So people with MS have difficulty controlling what their body does, and they have sensory problems. So it shows how important our neurons are and how important that myelin is around neurons. So this is just the basic structure of a neuron. And so in order to understand how neurons work, you have to be familiar with the basic structure of a neuron, the parts of the neuron. So you first have a cell body, and within that cell body contains the nucleus and our DNA. And then we also have dendrites. And a way that I've always found to remember dendrites is it looks like tree branches. And and dendrites is actually Greek for tree branches. And then so the dendrites are the head of the cell body. So as you can see right here, while we have the tail of the cell body, which are axons. So they grow out the other end of the cell body and they look like a tail. So the dendrites receive signal from other neurons and then it passes down to the tail. And the tail carries the signal away from the cell body. And then just a couple more in-depth parts of a neuron. We then have the myelin sheath, which it may be slightly difficult to tell on here, but the myelin sheath actually doesn't cover the entire length of the axon. So it's this part within the myelin sheath. And then we have our axon bulbs, and we also have, excuse me. So within our axon bulbs, we have vesicles that contain neurotransmitters, and those are chemical messengers that carry the signal across the synapse. And you can kind of see right there. And we'll get to what the synapse is and synaptic gap in a moment. There you are. And so the synapse, the reason why that is important is because it's very important to remember that neurons don't touch each other. They're separated by this tiny, tiny, tiny space. It's blown up so much because it's so tiny, it's very hard to see. Space called the synaptic gap. So the gap is just that space between neurons. And it's important for you to understand that communication takes place within a single neuron, and that differs from communication that occurs between two. So you have a presynaptic and a postsynaptic neuron. So it'll be very helpful to remember. Let me highlight pre and post. So presynaptic means that the neuron is sending the signal at the synapse. That neuron is sending the signal. Post, so you can think of it after, that neuron is receiving the signal. So I'll highlight this as well. And then, as I said, so the synapse is the jumps between the two axon bulbs, while the gap is the measurable difference between the two. So, and you can see on here, and it's very helpful to look at the pictures to kind of get in your head how it all works, is the sending neuron, the post is the receiving. So, how do neurons fire up? How do they signal? Well, the most important thing for you to remember is that within a neuron, communication is electrical in nature, but between two neurons, it's chemical. So, I'll make a text box right here. So within a neuron, the communication is electrical. Between neurons, it's chemical. So within the electrical potentials of a neuron, it's actually made possible by the presence of positive and negative ions. So within a neuron's inactive state, where it's not sending any signals, or it's known as the resting potential. So right here, Negative ions are more concentrated inside the neurons. So at resting potential, there are more negative ions than there are positive outside. So the opposite is true during an action potential. So at an active state, when a neuron is firing, the reversal occurs. So that means that there are the opposite. So there's more positives inside and negatives outside. So just keep that in mind. So I'm going to move this a little bit. There we are. Help you write this down. So let's say you're using your computer and you're getting a lot of errors. You have to restart it. So after you tell the system to restart, or if you're not the best with the computers, you just do a hard reset and press the power button. You have to wait for it to reset before you can use it. Neurons work that same way. So there is time between the reset. Before it can be used again. So after it fires, or experiences an action potential, it must reset all the way back. To a resting potential before it can fire again. So that this time, the time between, or the time where a neuron cannot fire is known as a refractory period. So, just an overview going back to, so we have what's known as resting potentials, where it's inactive, and then we have action potentials, where it's firing. And after it fires, it experiences an action potential. There is a time between where it cannot fire, or known as a refractory period. Okay, another text box. Boom, text box. So let's say, for example, you get to your home and you got to put your key in your lock. Neurons actually work the same way, much like a key has to go into a lock for it to open. So the keys, actually, there we are. Keys are neurotransmitters. They float across synaptic gap. They open those receptor sites on the surface of the next neuron. So you can kind of see it right there. So there's the receptors. So that's like the keyhole, and the neurons are the keys. Some keys, neurotransmitters, are like gas pedals. If I can spell gas pedals right. So they produce an excitation effect. Some keys we'll discuss when we talk about neurotransmitters what I mean by that. Some keys, neurotransmitters, are like brakes. They produce an inhibition effect. So after the neurotransmitters do their job, so go into the receptors right here, go into the receptors, carry that signal across the synapse. Some are left behind within the synapse. You could think of them as extras if you want. So they may be removed. So some are left behind. Well, in the synapse. That's a weird way to say it. But some are removed through reuptake, or they just degrade. So this is because the synapse is left clean, so the process can happen again. All right, so that's section one. Section one's pretty straightforward. So we got a general idea of what a neuron is, and we got a general idea of what a neuron is and the process of synaptic transmission for neurotransmitters. So moving on to section two. So section two is all about our neurotransmitters and what neurotransmissions are. Neurotransmitters are. Apologies. So we have neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. So neurotransmitters, they're all chemicals. That's something just keep in mind. But neuromodulators are chemicals within our nervous system, and they affect neural signaling, like we discussed. So when neurons talk to each other, without directly changing the resting potential of a postsynaptic cell. So it can happen, your neurons protect you from potential harmful, neuromodulators protect you from potential harmful substances. And some chemicals can act as a neurotransmitter, a neuromodulator, or a hormone. So for example, estrogen is a neurotransmission in a hippocampus, but outside the hippocampus, it's a hormone. And hippocampus is memory. It's a part of the brain that affects memory. So let's talk about some of those. First, we have acetylcholine, and it would be very unfair for me to tell you to worry about spelling, because as y'all have seen in class, I am a terrible speller. So I provide some shortened versions of this, but when you are working on your exam, just try and get as close to the spelling as you can. So acetylcholine was actually the first neurotransmitter discovered. A neurotransmitter, just to remind you, as I previously said, let me get a text box. There we go. There. A neurotransmitter is just a chemical that sends messages between neurons. There we are. So, as I was saying, acetylcholine is our first one that was found. So, It can function as an inhibitory or excitatory. Always remember inhibitory, like I was saying, it's like brakes, slows stuff down. Excitatory, speeds stuff up. So its focus now is very much plays a role in memory, but when it was first found, it was seen to inhibit or slow down the action weird spelling error, and to slow down the action of the here and excite skeletal muscles. So now it's thought to play a role in consciousness and memory. So, for example, there's been a huge relationship found, chapter 1, relationship, correlation, between acetylcholine activity and Alzheimer's disease. So, and it's marked, and as you probably know, Alzheimer's is marked by progressive or extensive memory loss and other functional deteriorations. So people with Alzheimer's, it has been found, they experience a loss of neurons that specifically release acetylcholine. So let's discuss some other neurotransmitters. I'm actually going to scroll this up. There we go. So a couple others. What I'm going to do, actually, I'm going to duplicate this slide. There we are. And then remove this. So another one, and this is probably one you've heard of before, dopamine. I can spell it right. See, this is why I tell you not to worry about spelling in my class. Like I said, it'd be slightly hypocritical. So that is a neurotransmitter that plays a role in reward, movement, motivation, learning, and attention. So it's a pretty important neurotransmitter. So it can influence motivation by making certain activities pleasurable or rewarding. So it can also play a role in the development of certain types of substance abuse. So what they mean by that is when someone takes a drug, dopamine is released. So it's tied to that release of dopamine, making using that drug more rewarding. It's also been found that people who suffer from Parkinson's have a loss of neurons in the part of the brain with the most dopamine. So drugs that treat Parkinson's work to indirectly increase the amount of dopamine within someone's brain. And care must be used with administering or giving people these drugs, because too much dopamine in the brain can produce very concerning symptoms, symptoms that are seen with people who suffer from schizophrenia. So too much dopamine can cause hallucinations like those seen in people who suffer from schizophrenia. All right, moving on. Now I'm going to delete this picture. And just to cover, this is I don't know if you may have heard of them. Muhammad Ali and Michael J. Fox, who both well known that suffer from Parkinson's. Muhammad Ali had died a couple years ago, but Michael J. Fox is actually still alive at this time of recording. All right, there we are. So moving on from there, we have serotonin. And I apologize, like trying to lose my voice, as you can tell. So serotonin plays a role in lots of different types of behaviors. And so it plays a role in sleep, arousal, mood, eating, and pain perception. So how you perceive pain. So people who lack serotonin, it's been found to be linked to several mental disorders, most commonly depression. So people who suffer from depression take SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So it helps increase the serotonin. So that would be like Prozac is probably the most well-known. So they have been found to be effective in treating depression, eating disorders, compulsive disorders such as OCD, and disorders. So even just helping with pain. And then our last one. Oh, there we go. I accidentally clicked on that. Apologies. Is norepinephrine. Oh, look at that. I spelled it right in the first try. So it plays a role in regulating sleep, arousal as well, and mood. So some drugs that alleviate depression have effect on NRO, or norepinephrine, as well as serotonin. And finally, and this is one you've probably heard, I call it the feel-good transmitter, endorphins. So endorphins are very interesting. So if you've ever broken a bone or caught your hand in a door, or that release of pain that's associated with a runner tie when you go on a long job, some severe injuries sometimes cause a sort of numbness, a sensation of numbness, where you might have expected pain. This is because of endorphins. So they block pain messages from making it to the brain. So it provides temporary relief, but it doesn't last for long. So So you experience that numbness of a broken bone, but that only lasts for a few moments where you start to hurt. So just a short summary. And like I said, we didn't go, as you can see, we didn't go over all of them. I just hit on the most common ones, the most well-known. So acetylcholine, so it's related to Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine, related to Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, and substance abuse. Serotonin, so that's sleep, arousal, mood, eating, pain, and perception. So it's been found to be related to depression, OCD, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, chronic pain. Norepinephrine, sleep, arousal, and mood. It's also been linked to depression as well as other mood disorders, such as bipolar disorder, which we'll discuss when we get to chapter 13. And then endorphins, they help with the suppression of pain, eating, and also cardiovascular functioning, and it's also been linked to depression as well. So, kind of hard to see, but just another. So you also have adrenaline, which is, and I'll read this off. I'm sure it's hard to see. Tied to fight or flight. Dopamine, that would be pleasure. Serotonin, mood. Endorphins, euphoria. Acetylcholine has actually been linked to learning, interestingly enough. So section 3. So just a quick summation. So we discussed the structure of a neuron, right? And then we discussed how neurotransmitters work and a little bit about neuromodulators and how they work. So now we got to discuss the structure of the nervous system. So we're going to hit on the peripheral nervous system, the somatic nervous system, and then autonomic nervous system. So you first and foremost, the function of the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, ensures that the CNS, or the central nervous system, is informed about what's happening within your body and outside of your body. So the peripheral nervous system has what's called sensory neurons. So they send information to the central nervous system from the world. So sights, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're feeling, touching. So our 5 senses. And it takes over as it acts out the directives of the CNS. So it does what the CNS wants it to do. So, excuse me. So for example, and I love this example, it's a really good one. So you see a really juicy apple while you're randomly in an orchard. So the sensory neurons of the eye send that information to the part of the brain that processes visual information. So visual information travels to the eye with the sensory pathways that carry visual information to the brain. All right. So here the brain recognizes that it's an apple, it interprets it and goes, oh, that's an apple. And then you decide to eat the apple. So that brain then sends signals downward to the motor neurons of your hand and arm, which in turn direct you to reach out and grasp the apple of the hand. So the peripheral nervous system sees the apple. The CNS tells the peripheral nervous system to eat the apple. So it carries out the directives. So just a little quick on the subsystems of the peripheral nervous system. So the somatic and the autonomic. So reaching for that apple as I talked about on the previous slide, requires the activation of the somatic nervous system. So that governs sensory and voluntary motor action. So moving your arms, moving your legs. So the brain makes the decision to reach for the apple, and that order, the directive from the CNS is sent downward across those motor neurons of the somatic nervous systems that control the muscles of the arm. So the arm muscles react to the orders of the CNS, and you reach for the apple. And then the functioning of the somatic nervous system enables you to control your body in a direct, deliberate manner. So it's voluntary motor action. So somatic is voluntary motor action, while autonomic is not. So autonomic controls like your breathing, that your heart needs to beat, that your liver needs to do its job. Imagine that you had to do that actively, that you had to tell like parts of your body had to actively and voluntarily remind you to breathe. It wouldn't go well, probably. So you would have very little energy and attention left for thinking and learning because you're applying all that attention and action to having to do that. So it would get exhausting. So, what if there was a threatening situation that you had to respond to? If you had to like tell your legs to run very quickly to escape something, probably wouldn't go well. So thankfully, we have what's known as the autonomic nervous system. So it helps us respond to it helps respond for normal functioning of our body. So it regulates organ functions, and it's equipped actually with these separate divisions that help us survive in a possible dangerous situation or stressful situation. So that's just a quick rundown of, just going back to summarize, the structure of our nervous system. The peripheral system, the somatic, which is voluntary, somatic, voluntary, and then autonomic, that is involuntary. It's autonomous, it's automatic. So there we are. On to section 4. Let me fix this real quick. Well, that's okay. So now we're going to discuss parts of the brain. It's fun, I swear. So first we'll start off with the central processing unit, like the overview of our brain. So we have our hindbrain, our forebrain, and our midbrain. So our hindbrain is so named because it's at the bottom. So it's chilling right here. It's at the bottom of our. And then our forebrain, that's our emotional, it's at the top of the skull. Kind of hard to see. And then our midbrain is right here. It's super hard to see, but there you go. I would look in your book to get a better view of it. But as we do this, I break each part down. So it'll be easier to see as we're looking through the slides. So our forebrain is the emotional, motivational, and cognitive processes. So it's at the top part. So fore, it's first. Hind, it's back. So, and then mid, it's middle. That'll make it probably very easy to remember. And then our midbrain helps our forebrain with neuro impulses. So it keeps us remaining active and keeps us conscious. So it's pretty important for being, the middle of the brain. So the human hindbrain, shown in blue, so right here, governs basic life and sustaining functions. The midbrain, you can see it in red, is so hard to see. But let me see if I can zoom in. Oh, I can. See it right there? The little red part. There we go. It connects the lower structures of the hindbrain to the higher structures of the forebrain. And then the forebrain, which is tan, governs the like cognition, sensory processing, planning, and execution of behaviors. So a lot of psychologists are very interested in the hindbrain. So let's break each one of these down. So we have three major parts, and I'm going to discuss a little bit about these, and then we'll move on to the midbrain. So the hindbrain is actually the oldest level of the brain. So these it contains essential parts of the brain that actually don't really distinguish us from animals. So these areas are crucial, but they're not advanced functions. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So we first have our medulla. So it does respiration, heart rate, blood pressure, all that good stuff. So even somewhat minute or minuscule damage to the medulla can result in death from heart or respiratory failure because it can regulate heartbeat and respiration. So it also, interesting enough, plays a role in sneezing, coughing, vomiting, swallowing, and digestion. So what I'm basically saying is don't damage your medulla. You need that guy. And then we have our pons. So our pons sit above the medulla. Let me zoom. Zoom. And scroll. So, and I'll enhance. There we go. So it's kind of hard to see, but there's the pons. There's the medulla. So, and then let me get back. Oh, there we go. The pons, if they become damaged, that bridge between the bridge between the medulla and the spinal cord, you can kind of see it right there. Serious motor sensory damages result. So because it's a bridge for neurosignals, it can result in damage or what's the word I'm looking for? Impairment, the word I just used, to respiration, consciousness, sleeping, dreaming, facial movements, sensory processes. Pons are pretty important as well. And then finally, our cerebellum, our cerebellum, and then you can see it. Let's see, right there. There's a cerebellum. It kind of looks like broccoli, in my opinion. Without it, we would not be able to learn or accomplish such tasks as riding a bicycle. So it's very important for balance, muscle tone, and coordination of motor movement. So alcohol, in fact, impairs the functioning of the cerebellum and some other forebrain structures. So, so when somebody drinks a lot of alcohol, they stagger around, they're clumsy, they have a slowed reaction time because it impairs the functioning of the cerebellum. And then abnormalities or just a weirdness to the cerebellum have been found to result in mental health issues like depression and bipolar disorder. So it's thought that it plays a role in perception and emotion. And then, so the next level of brain tissue, our midbrain, contains the reticular formation. There we are. So the reticular formation is a structure that acts as a bridge, similarly to bonds, of sorts between the lower and higher brain structures. So the hindbrain and the forebrain. So the reticular formation is actually located near the pons. You can kind of see it right about there. And it's involved with arousal, states of consciousness, which we'll talk about in chapter 4, cardiovascular and respiratory activity and movement. So it's very important as well. And it's also been regulating arousal levels, which makes sense with consciousness as well. And finally, we have our forebrain, our last part of the brain. So our forebrain is the most recent and most advanced level of brain tissue, and it contains a bunch of different structures. So it first has the limbic system. So that would be the amygdala, which is emotional regulation, and the hippocampus, which is memory. And it's as I was saying, is just a system of structures that are all about emotion, motivation, and memory. And then we have our thalamus. Our thalamus is the part that functions as a sensory relay station. So if you have damage to your thalamus, you might have issues with sensory perception. And then we have our hypothalamus. So it plays a role in maintaining homeostasis. So sleep, body temperature, sexual behavior, thirst, hunger, and also where the nervous system intersects with our endocrine system. So each of these parts of the forebrain play different roles in both psychological and physiological functioning. I would strongly recommend making flashcards if you have a hard time telling the difference between these to help you kind of get in your brain, to help you remember which is which. And then the brain is also far more complicated and complex than I could ever present. So you're getting like the most basic introduction to brain structures. And honestly, you could study the brain for years before you can have even a basic understanding of its functions and vast potential. So like I've been studying psychology and parts of the brain for 12 years over. And I still would say I have the most basic of understanding of it. So moving on from there, we have our good old cortex. All right. So this is probably going to sound familiar to you. This is probably the most well-known part. So our brain is the cerebral cortex is the largest structure, and it's so large that it has to be divided into two halves, two hemispheres. You probably might remember that. You have your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere. And then it has 4 areas, lobes. This one being the one that develops last, our frontal lobe. So make sure that you're clear that that means there's actually 8 total lobes, because 1 for each side. Fun, right? 4 on the left, 4 on the right. So the left and right hemispheres each have more input on different functions. So there's lateralization. But that doesn't mean that people are left brain or right brain. It's just the idea that there's lateralization, because if there wasn't and you had some slight damage to your brain, then your whole brain would be out of commission. So that's why lateralization exists. So different lobes have unique functions, and we'll actually go into a little bit slightly what they are, but I do want to hit on like some interesting ones. Like language. So the Broca's area, this guy right here, is responsible for speech production. What I am saying right now and the ability of me saying it is thanks to my Broca's area, which is the left temporal lobe. Boom, that guy right there, as I was saying. The vernix area is the in the left, or sorry, I said left frontal. And the vernix area is in the left temporal. Boom, that guy right there. And that is responsible for language comprehension. What you are hearing right now and the ability to understand me is thanks to this guy, Vernick. Thanks. Well, his area, I guess. So you can see how those related functions are handled in the same half of the brain, but two different areas. So imagine that if they weren't, and you had slight damage to the area of your brain, you would not be able to speak or understand people. But there are some people who have damage to their Broca's area. So Broca's area meaning language production. They hear in their brain and can hear what you're saying right now. But if they talk to you and try and tell you something, they may say, the cat is outside, or they mean to say the cat is outside, but what they actually say is trip, fall, 7, 5. Because, or they may not be even to be able to produce it. So people with Broca's area damage can understand. So their vernix area is working, but they can't produce. So that's lateralization for you. Okay, so let's look at a brain. Well, more brains. So that's a human brain, and that's a domestic cat brain. It's just small. So the brain, like I was saying before, is extraordinarily complicated, and it takes extensive study to fully understand. I don't expect you to have all this down by any means. So a brief review would include for each of the lobes, just to give you a quick rundown. And I would strongly recommend looking at your text as well. Our frontal lobe, that's all about the association cortex, Broca's area, cognitive processes, personality, motor cortex. So damage to your frontal lobe could result in you not being able to produce language, not making brash decisions, because cognitive processes, very drastic changes to your personality, not being able to control your body as well. The parietal lobe, that's association cortex, soma sensatory, it's a hard word to say, apologies. Cortex, so touch, pressure, pain. So people with parietal lobe damage don't, some do not feel pain, and they can also not feel the ability to touch things. Occipital lobe, that's a visual cortex. So damage to your occipital lobe could result in you not having vision issues. Temporal lobe, that's auditory, so hearing. Damage to your temporal lobe can result in hearing issues. How do we study the brain? What are ways we can study the brain? Okay, and I'm not going to spend a long time on this. I don't expect you to have a really far-reaching grasp on this, just to provide a quick overview. So we have CAT scans. It looks at brain structures. So it just looks to see what the brain looks like. So X-ray beams are used to do this. It's passed from the brain at different angles, and all those X-rays go in together to form a complete view of the brain. So it provides a detailed picture of it. An MRI also looks at the structure of the brain as well, but a magnetic field is used. to do this. So if you've ever gone in an MRI and they ask you if you have any piercings or you have to take them off, and if you actually have rods, because that can happen, people who have rods for bones, they cannot go into MRIs because it's magnetic field. It could possibly yank it out of their skin. So it looks at brain structures as well. And then PET scans actually look for what parts of the brains are active. So depending on what they want to look at, they would try and activate the part of the brain. If they were looking at the part of the brain that's all about auditory, they would talk to them and have them talk back to see how active it is. So then we have an fMRI. So it tracks areas of the brain and also brain structures. So it tracks neurons that are most active. And then we have EEGs. That's the thing where you see them put like, pieces of things on people's brains. That's an EEG. And they're measured at points along the scalp, and they give information across gross patterns, gross meaning big, of brain activation. So they look at electrical activity in the lobes. And then brain stimulation, it's neat. So they stimulate parts of the brain depending on what they want to look at. It's actually been shown to help treat depression. They call them brain pacemakers. It's pretty neat, actually. So that is it for, I totally lied to you. I said that was brief. That was not brief. That was a pretty in-depth overview. But if you have any questions, that is what class is for, of course. You can email me with any questions as well. But if not, have a great day.